it's Sarah with Fair Heart, and I'm excited to create this project of the month with you. This is just a really fun and easy project that is great for fall season. Um, so what we're going to do, I'm going to break down what you need to create this sign, whether you have your own projects or your own supplies at home, or if you got the kit with your project of the month. What we're going to need is whatever paint colors you want to use. Some tape is just a good thing to have on hand to kind of separate some of the lines. You can also use a sanding block or a piece of sandpaper for just kind of giving a fun distressed look. You can either use brushes or sponges, kind of whatever you have on hand. I prefer for lettering like this to use a sponge because it helps from having paint seep into or onto the sides. Brushes are kind of nice just so you can get some different textures for the other parts of the project. And then you'll need some glue at the end too to get this all attached together. The glue that I prefer to use is either E6000, or you could use super glue, Gorilla Glue, wood glue, anything that's going to hold this together real good and solid. So let's go ahead and get started. You're going to want to take this apart, separate the pieces. We're going to do them all a little bit separately. And then we've got our little leaf over here. All right, so what I'm actually going to do is for this box, I am going to leave this background just the plain wood. So what I am going to do, either you can be really careful because see this comes down to about this level, like it's going to be covered up until about here. So you could just kind of carefully brush into that, and it's okay if you go over, as long as you don't get into this area. Or if you want to be safe, you can just take some tape, whatever tape you have on hand, and then I would just go a little bit down below those lines, tape it off, and that way you don't have to worry about accidentally getting your brush in the wrong spot. So what we'll do is we'll paint these pumpkins, and kind of the same thing, you actually don't have to paint this inside pumpkin except for this top edge, so you don't even have to fill it all in, but you can if you want. I'm going to start by painting this piece because I'm going to paint the pumpkin, and then I'm going to actually kind of show you a way that you can stain this by using a wet cloth. You could use a baby wipe, whatever you have on hand, to just basically wipe some paint on here without it being really solid, because I want some of the wood grain to show. So the colors that I'm going to start with, I've got some brown, some yellow, and orange for the pumpkins, but I'm going to use the brown to stain this crate. Now what I do want to do is tape this edge because I don't want my brown to get into the pumpkin. Although if you do get a little bit on there, it's okay because we're going to be painting the pumpkin afterwards, so you can clean up any edges that you need to. All right, I have a wet rag. This was like a baby wipe. It was actually all dried out, so I just dipped it in my water and wrung it out. But it's a good way to use, old baby wipes. What you're going to do is kind of just get some of that on here. And this is a real easy way to basically stain something without it getting super messy. So you just basically dip it in your paint, kind of wipe some of it off, and then you're just going to use that wet rag and push it all around. And this also makes it it makes it dry really quickly. And you can kind of layer it if you want to darken it anymore. You can definitely do that. And just basically do this again. Nope, I don't want to get any on my other board. And this brown is kind of a reddish brown, which I like. It gives it a little bit more color, but you could use any sort of brown. And then I'm just going to kind of wipe some of this. So I really like what this does. It basically stains it without you having to, you know, another method would be to like water down some paint. You could brush it on and wipe it off, but this kind of does it all in one step, which is pretty cool. And you could do the same method for the pumpkins if you want, or the gather. But here's how this looks so far. So if I just leave this, you could leave it, you know, with this being just the straight wood if you want that contrast. So I like to kind of lay it out and see how it looks as I go. But I do think that does look kind of cool. You could alternatively use a different color. You could even do that with blacks, which black might look kind of cool as an option. Maybe what I'll do is I'll wait till the end and we'll see how this all comes together like that with this painted too. And so we'll see how it all comes together, and then maybe what I'll do too is I'll paint it black so you can kind of see how it looks both ways. Okay, so we are gonna switch over to painting pumpkins. So for this, we could do the same method, honestly. You could just take the same rag even and basically just kind of get a base coat on your pumpkins with some orange, and you could just literally stain your pumpkins in a very similar manner. But what I do want to do is add some like highlights and whatnot. And again, you don't even actually have to paint this middle pumpkin, but it only takes a second to do so. I'm just going to go ahead and paint the these stems, even though that's going to be a different color. It will just look a lot more even. Like if you overlap that on accident, it just looks more even if you just paint the whole thing. That way you don't have any lines when you go to use green or brown, you know, whatever color you want to paint your stems. It's all even. Okay, so I'm gonna set that aside and do this other one. So same thing, but this time I'm going to take my tape and I'm just gonna switch it to the other side. And it's not sticking super well because that is still kind of wet. So I'm just gonna take a little more tape. I don't know if this is gonna help at all. Stick that down. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing, dip it in my paint, kind of wipe it off, and then I'm just doing circles. You can do smears. Get this bottom edge really quick. Dip again. Okay. Does not take very long at all. And then we can kind of see how this is laying together. So this definitely needs some highlights and lowlights. So I'm going to paint the pumpkins in a little bit more starting with the background. So this time I'm going to grab a brush, just a medium round brush is what I'm going to use, and I'm going to use some of the white or the yellow, and we're just going to make some streaks basically. Could also do this with a sponge, just depends what you're more comfortable with. If you're going to use a sponge, like a makeup sponge, you could do the same thing, just pick a little bit of that up, kind of do a smear. It's a little harder to get a detail edge, but you could also kind of take the skinny side of it like this and do a smear like that, and even use your finger to blend it in. So multiple ways depending on what you have. There's lots of different ways that you can add some detail, and so this just adds a little highlight. It makes it more interesting. You could do the same thing if you wanted to create a shadow. If you take a little bit, I'm going to use my brush, a little bit of brown and some yellow, maybe a little bit of that orange, and basically just kind of make a like a darker, dirtier orange. Make some creases, some shadowed edges. Just kind of go along the lines. All right, let's see how that layers. Yeah, it's kind of coming alive a little bit more. Some of this brown I'm not super fond of, so I'm going to take a little bit of that, more of the orange, and just kind of blend over it. So if there's any colors that you don't really like as much, you can just kind of paint over it with that orange color, and that'll help soften it. Just make it a little bit less brown is what I want. But it's good to have some shadowing, some darker colors. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to layer this right over top so I can kind of see what I did with the other ones and mimic that a little bit. So I'm going to do some highlights and take my sponge and just kind of curve around like that. I guess I should also mention too, it's you want to just trust the process here, because I know that sometimes, you know, when you're in the middle of doing something like this, it's like, oh, this isn't looking how I want. Every painting, I think, goes through that stage. And so just keep going, don't give up on it, and you'll see how it'll all come together in the end. All right, I'm going to take some of that darker. So basically all I'm doing is taking my bright orange that I used for the backgrounds of the pumpkin and just adding a little bit of the brown, maybe a little bit of the yellow. And that just kind of makes a darker, kind of dirtier orange. And that is good for these creases. So I'm basically just going right along the pumpkin line and then just kind of blending with my finger. So, and if there's any other spots that you don't like the color, I'm going to clean out my brush really quick and just kind of take some plain bright orange, and you can just kind of add some of those streaks. You know, if there's any places that you don't really like as much of. Or if you want it to be a little bit more solid. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Worst case scenario, if you are kind of going along and you are trusting the process and you just get to the end and you're like, yep, this is just not what I want, you can always paint over it. That's never an issue, especially with painting with acrylics. It's real easy to just go over top of it and try again. So I'm going to peel my tape off, see how it looks. Yeah, it looks pretty good. And what I do want to do is just kind of clean up some of those edges. So I'm just going to take my brush, now that it's clean, and just really carefully go right up to that line, because there's some spots that are either a little messy, kind of blurry, or like it bled a little bit under the tape, some of the brown. So I'm just cleaning up that edge. Just doing any touch-ups. It's a good time to do that. Okay, so I'm happy with the pumpkins. I want to paint the stems next. So I think what I'm going to do is just paint those brown. It'll kind of tie in with the brown here. So I'm just going to use my brush for that. At least for this one, I'm going to show you just how I use the brush. I know it seems really obvious, but there is a best way to do this, and it's to not, you don't want to load up your paint too much. And the hard part is to not get the paint to seep over the edge, which is why it's so important to not overload your brush when you do this. Just like that. And then if you were going to use a sponge, it'd be, you just take a little bit of your paint on the corner of your brush, kind of tap some of it off, because you don't want it to be too loaded. If you can see the paint on there, and it's really shiny, there's probably too much. And this, you just kind of dab it on. I'm going to take this off so I don't accidentally get on the wrong spot. And then just kind of carefully fill in the spots that you want. I'm just going to paint this one too, just in case. That way if there's any overlap, it doesn't show. But obviously it's going to be a little bit easier to just use a brush to get these parts that meet, like the base of the stem, that meet the pumpkin. A little bit easier, more control to do it that way, but it's definitely possible to do it with a sponge, if that's what you have. Okay, I'm just going to set that on there again so we can kind of see the progress that we're making. So I'm going to paint my little leaf next. He's going to go right here. And I'm going to use kind of a sage green. We're going to use a little bit of a dark green and add some of the yellow to it to make it kind of a sage. And of course I got way too much paint. So I'm just going to take some of this, mix it together. And I can roll the brush to kind of offload some of that paint. And that's pretty much all that we're going to need. You can actually just kind of hold it like this and just paint it on. just carefully so you're not going to get too much excess paint off of the edges. All right, so all that we have left to do is paint the gather. If you want to, you can absolutely just leave it like this if you want. But I am going to paint it. Maybe I'll do yellow. Yellow or white would be pretty. It's a tough call. You could do any color. You could do teal. That would look pretty. You could go with black. But I think, let's see. I think I might just do white. And you can reuse these sponges. So when I'm done using it, I just put it in my water and squeeze it out and rinse and reuse it. And they end up looking like this, you know, but that's fine. If they ever get too crusty, you can just snip the crusty edge off. So I usually get, you know, 4 or 5 uses out of them, which is pretty great. Okay, so there's lots of ways you can do it. You can either kind of hold it like this and dab it. What I typically like to do for a lot of things is hold it like this. But since we have more area to cover, I think I'll use this edge. So make sure your other pieces are out of the way. You're just going to dip it and offload it because you don't want it to be really shiny. And dab it on. And you can kind of see if you like the color, just hover over it, because you can always switch it if you don't, you know, if you want to switch over to black or something else, go a different direction, you can always paint over this. And the important part to try to do is keep all your edges clean. So some of these, like there's a tiny bit of an overlap, but it's not much to fuss about. If you were to paint over, like use a brush and paint it, it's a lot harder to control the bleed over. So that's why I prefer with lettering like this or any pieces like this, it's a lot easier, I think, in my opinion, to sponge. And you get a nice powdery texture. So you just want to make sure that there's not like, see there's some excess paint there, just be aware. Just dab it real gentle. And what I usually do when I get one edge done, I'll flip it around so I can kind of hold on to it. Something got on there. Just like that. And you can either just do one coat and kind of leave it, you know, it might be a little light in some areas, but if you're good with that, then that's totally fine. Or if you want it really solid, you can do a second coat. So I just had an idea. I think I want to add maybe a little bit of gold. So while the paint is still wet, I really love the DecoArt brand Dazzling Metallics. That's one of my favorites. So if I just put a little bit of gold on my brush and do the same thing, I think this will look pretty cool because it'll give it like a a marbled, yeah, like a shimmery, and just barely put it on there. Kind of leave some of that white so it kind of looks antiqued. So it kind of blends a little bit because the paint is still wet, but it doesn't blend in so much that it becomes the same color. In some areas can be a little bit darker. Yes, that's cool. So I might have some spots where there's a little more gold. That looks cool. Yeah. All right. So, oh yeah, I was going to paint the back side, like the underside, black. And I think that that might look kind of cool now, especially with the gather being such a light color. If we had some contrasting black, I think that would look cool. So I'm just going to get a little bit of black paint and do the same thing. I'm just going to use the same washcloth or the same rag. Dip a little bit of black in, kind of wipe it off, and then just go along. And this doesn't even have to be the whole thing. You can just kind of do this middle area where those holes are going to be. Pretty much just like that. Yes, that looks very cool. I like that. Yeah, it kind of gives it more of a contrast. All right. So another thing that you could do just for a couple extra little highlights, if you took a smaller brush, you could take a little bit of white paint and kind of do like a little a highlight here on the stem. Just a little line. And just gives it a pop of shimmer contrast, you know, having that white look like the sun is shining on it. This is totally optional. You don't have to do that. You could also do it on the leaf. Just have a little bit of a highlight there. And you could do it on the pumpkin, just a little bit. Less is more. I'm barely tickling it, like just real softly. And then just kind of blend it. I don't have much paint on my brush at all. Just kind of using whatever's left over, just hitting a couple of spots. Just so it has something, some little highlight to kind of catch the eye. Yeah, so all optional. All right, so this is pretty much ready to glue together. So like I said, you can use wood glue, E6000, whatever you have available. E6000 is what I'm going to use. It's one of my favorite glues. If you're opening a new bottle, just puncture the top with the cap. So the thing I like about the E6000 is that it doesn't stick immediately like super glue does. So what you want to do is kind of take your project apart again, and we're going to flip it upside down and just get a good thin line kind of evenly across the outside. So kind of just like this. Now, if you're using super glue, you definitely don't need this much glue. I just do a very thin line and just kind of spread it out. If you're using super glue, you probably only need to get the corners and then maybe like a couple of drops in the middle here. I'm just going to add a little bit on the pumpkin. And I also want to add just a little bit, kind of thinly add glue over top of the whole stem so that way it doesn't get caught. Because I kind of think about that. So this is what I do. Just kind of a thin layer of glue. And then we're going to press it down really good. But what I like about E6000 is it gives you some time to kind of maneuver it into the spot that you want. So if you don't get it exactly in the correct spot right away, you have some wiggle room to shift it, versus super glue, you know, where you put it, if you don't have it in the right spot within a couple of seconds, you're kind of stuck with it. So there's a little more pressure involved. And then I just press it down, you know, give it a good solid, firm hold. Okay, and then we're just going to keep adding our other pieces. Real quick and easy. And this leaf you can add wherever you want, but I'm just going to add them right there. Now, I think this is all dry. It dries so quick. It's really nice. Okay, so for this, I'm basically more worried about my end pieces, but you want to just get a real thin layer across the whole thing. That is your best bet. But especially for these end pieces, make sure that you get some there. And I'm barely squeezing it out. Like, it's kind of more, you squeeze a little bit, but then you spread it as you squeeze. That way it gets just a really thin, you don't need a whole bead of glue over the whole thing. You just need to kind of spread it out thin. And I'll usually kind of hover it. You want to make sure that these ends are in the proper place. Don't forget to cap your glue. These will usually last for like 2 or 3 projects depending on the size. So I like those the little bottles, and I squeeze every last drop out and I use every little bit that I can. Okay, so that's that. It's all together. If you are not using super glue, then my best advice is to just let it rest at least for a couple of hours. I have had issues before, especially when I first started using this glue. I would prop it up to display it right away, and sometimes the pieces can slide a little bit. So just let it rest, and you can also, as long as it's totally dry, you can put like a heavy book on it. It's not absolutely needed, but if for whatever reason, if some of your pieces like feel like they're kind of pulling up and away from the glue because it's like warped or anything, depending on how the project was stored, all your pieces should be stored flat until you paint them. So if you had any issues with it warping for whatever reason, just set something heavy down on top of it. That way it can't lift up. So another thing that you could do too is you could add a couple little like highlight marks on your crate, but at this point that's kind of too late. That was an afterthought of mine, so I apologize that I didn't think about that earlier. But yeah, anytime you want to add little highlights or stuff like that, it really helps bring it all together, just make it more interesting. And for this, if you want to hang this, real easy thing you can do is just take some twine and just squeeze like about a pea-size amount of glue on the back, and you'll just knot, like create a knot, like a couple of thick knots at the end of the twine, stick those knots in there, and you'll have a nice little hanger. It's real sturdy. If you do that, what I like to do is just take a piece of tape over it. That way it just helps keep it in position, because you don't want to use that twine until several hours later once the glue is dry. But otherwise, this makes a really cute shelf sitter. You could put it in a little easel and display it however you want. Put it on the mantle, wherever you want to add it. I would love to see photos. If you want to send me a picture of your project, post it inside of our Makers Box Facebook group or send us an email. We'd love to see how your project turned out. So I hope you had fun with this, and I'm looking forward to the next project. Hopefully we will see you then. And until then, never stop creating. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.